Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Southern Fire Exchange webinar. My name is David Godwin, and I'm the director of the Southern Fire Exchange program with the University of Florida. And from our Southern Fire Exchange team, we're joined today by Elliot Nauert with NC State University. Today, we're excited to feature a presentation by Cinnamon Dixon, fire ecologist at Tall Timbers Research Station in Tallahassee, Florida. Cinnamon will be talking about her work looking at prescribed fire as a tool for restoring agricultural and former agricultural lands in North Florida and South Georgia. If you're not familiar with our program, a little bit about the Southern Fire Exchange. SFE, as we call it, is a regional program for fire science delivery in the southeastern U.S. We are a collaborative among the University of Florida, Tall Timbers Research Station, and NC State University. We're funded by the Joint Fire Science Program, and we are the southeastern branch of the nationwide Fire Science Exchange Network. We work with partners across the region, like Tall Timbers and others, develop programs, opportunities, and events like this one that seek to bridge the divide between the fire science and natural resource management communities. We have over 100 of our past fire science and management webinars like this one recorded and posted to our YouTube webinar archive. So we know that these can be great resources for your own professional development. They cover pretty much any topic you can think of, and we're adding more all the time. RT 130 courses and refreshers and online classes. So you can scan that QR code on the screen if you can get that to work, and go over to our YouTube channel, and Elliot's got it there in the link in the chat window. Thanks. If you are joining us today from an area outside of the southeastern US, I saw some folks already in the chat introducing themselves. Welcome. We're glad you're here. We hope this program will be useful and helpful for you. But we also encourage you to look into connecting with your local Fire Science Exchange network. These are the folks that are working to connect, just like us, fire scientists, fire managers, and practitioners within the region. So you can go to firescience.gov for more information. You'll find a map like this one where you can connect with your local Fire Science Exchange. So enough for me. It's now time to hand things over to Cinnamon Dixon for her presentation. So welcome, Cinnamon. I'm excited to see your presentation. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And one moment as we trade things out on Zoom and get things rolling.
All right, so hopefully everyone can see that and hear me.
Yep, it looks good. Go right ahead. Thanks.
Oh, fantastic. All right, so hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me this afternoon. Like David said, my name is Cinnamon Dixon. I am a fire ecologist at Tall Timbers. My primary focus is looking at plant communities and their response to fires, and how fire regimes, either changes in frequency or season, might alter and impact those plant communities. But today I'm going to be talking a little about some research that we did looking at the restoration of pine savannas and the ecosystem services that those systems provide. So all of the research that I'm going to be talking about today can be found in this publication that we had come out in 2022. And I believe they're going to be sharing a link to this in the chat if you're interested in getting a little bit more detail about what I'm going to be discussing today. So as I'm sure you guys are all familiar already, because you are in the Southeast, a little bit of an overview of kind of the systems that we're looking at today. So pine savannas are these open canopy systems dominated by pines. The one we're talking about today is typically a longleaf pine, and it has this continuous herbaceous ground cover. It's very diverse, and it requires frequent fire to maintain it. Now, historically, these were pretty dominant ecosystems throughout the Southeast coastal plain. You can see here in the map in green where you have the historical range of longleaf pine. But throughout the years, that has changed a lot. A lot is due to land use conversion, so things like agriculture, whether it's row crops or pine plantations or even urban development. We've lost a lot of the pine savannas that we've had. So there's been a lot of interest in restoring them. And here's an example of just kind of what the Southeast looked like in 1931. So this is an outline, the red outline of Tall Timbers Research Station. So these are historical aerial photos that we have. And all these white areas that you see, these are all fields. These are all cleared areas. And you can see that was a big chunk of Tall Timbers was cleared and under agriculture at one point. And this will change throughout the years. So some years you'd have a field in one spot, they'd kind of let it go fallow, grow up. and then you'd have a field pop somewhere else, and maybe another one will come back. So it's a change over the years as the fields would kind of come and go. But this is a pretty common appearance throughout the Southeast. However, we do have some areas that had never been under agriculture. Back in 2001, Christine Ambrose actually kind of did a little drive-by survey of the Red Hills region, so that area between Tallahassee, Florida, and Thomasville, Georgia, and kind of was just looking to see what kind of areas do we have that are native ground cover, native savannas, so things that, based on the plant life that we're seeing, so things like wiregrass and longleaf pine and goat's rue, really species that are indicative of that native ground cover that's never been in agriculture. And we do have, a good bit. I mean, obviously that these green areas that were never tilled is a fraction of the entire area, but it does still exist. And so since we have a little bit of native ground cover and we have a lot of areas that, could support pine savanna, there's a lot of interest in restoring these systems. And one of the things that we think we'll gain by restoring pine savannas is an increase in ecosystem services, which leads to the question of, well, what's an ecosystem service, right? So an ecosystem service is any ecological process or product that is a benefit to humans. As you can imagine, this is, a very large, a large number of things that will fall within these categories. Typically, we like to break ecosystem services up into different categories. So we'd have something that we'd call a provisioning service. So these are those direct material and energy outputs that we'd get. So things like timber or water from the groundwater recharge or game, food, forage, things like that. We have ones that we call regulating services. So these are processes that help to regulate the ecosystem. Things that you're looking at, like, what's regulating the air quality, water quality, climate. So things like carbon sequestration, soil stabilization, pollination. These are things that we'd consider as regulating services. We also have what we consider as supporting services. So these are the things that are essential to the system surviving. So these are kind of like your basic services that are needed. So things like biodiversity and wildlife habitat. And then finally, we have cultural services. These are ones that there's not a direct, material that you're being provided with by the system. It's more of these kind of like intangible benefits, like you enjoy the aesthetics of the system, or maybe you like to go out bird watching or hunting. Those will all be considered more of a cultural service. But no matter what category they're in, you have different landscapes that will provide different services and at different levels. So this is probably a pretty familiar sight to most of you. This is kind of a hardwood forest that you'd see in the Southeast. So basically it's a fire excluded forest. And the services that you might get from this would obviously be very different than you get from your pasture, which is fine. It all depends on what you're looking for. And so we wanted to see, like, how does this differ from what you see in our native pine savannas? So for our study, we had two main objectives. We wanted to infer the changes in multiple ecosystem services over 100 years since the abandonment of agriculture. So you abandon agriculture, you restore your pine savanna, whatever restored pine savanna looks like. And we wanted to see, like, what kind of ecosystem services and how does that change over time? We also wanted to compare that to some ecosystem service levels of other common land uses that we have. So to kind of put a picture on what we're doing here is we start here. So you start with your row crop agriculture site. You decide to abandon agriculture. You're not going to do any active restoration. There's no seeding going on. You're not planting any plugs for plants or anything. You're just going to let seeds disperse in passively, so kind of a passive succession, but you're going to apply fire frequently. So in our systems, fire was applied to these sites about every 1 to 2 years. So I know that's pretty frequent, but that's really what these systems need in this kind of clay hill, pretty fertile Red Hills region. So we wanted to know, if you do that and you reach this lovely kind of restored old field pine savanna, what kind of services did you get? How long did it take you to get those? And how does that compare to what you started with? So for our study, we looked at 6 main land cover types. So we had current row crop agriculture. Now these were sites that are currently being used. They're being disked annually. They're being fertilized. Usually lime is applied to kind of adjust the pH, but they're not irrigated. We also looked at restored pine savannas. So these are ones where agriculture had been abandoned about 5 to 15 years ago, 15 to 30 years ago, 30 to 50 years ago, 50 to 75 years ago, or 75 to 100 years ago. We also looked at our reference or native pine savanna. So these are areas that, as far as we can tell, there's no evidence that they've ever been under agriculture. They had a pretty good intact native ground cover. We looked at improved pastures. These are typically planted with the hay grass and used for either hay production or actively had either cows or horses grazing on them. We also included pine plantations. That's a pretty common land use around here. So these were planted pines for fiber and wood pulp productions. They were typically around 7 to 30 years old. If a land manager had applied prescribed fire, it hadn't happened for at least 5 years since we went in there to take our measurements, but most of them were fire excluded. And then finally, we looked at these fire excluded or unmanaged hardwood forests. So these were areas that were closed canopy. They could support pine savannas because they were upland areas, but they had just been fire excluded and allowed to, succession took its course and created this kind of unmanaged hardwood forest system. So like I mentioned, our study took place in this Red Hills region, and it's kind of North Florida, Southwest Georgia, between Thomasville and Tallahassee. In the region, we've looked at 4 study areas. So you can see here, so we took 2 years to kind of study each of these areas. And we named them after the largest property that we were primarily working on, but we really were able to gather all the data that we did on all these different land covers by the help of a lot of private citizens were willing to let us come out and take measurements on their, on their crop sites or on their pastures. And so we're very thankful for everyone who was able to really just said, yes, go collect data and let me know what you find. So for each of these study areas, we did have at least 2, usually 3 or 4 of each of those land cover categories. So for example, at the tall timbers, we had at least 2 crop sites, we had at least 2 unmanaged, we had at least 2 of each of the different restored pine savannas, because we really wanted to get an idea of like what is going on in the whole region and not just, one particular area. So the way we identified our sites, especially these restored pine savannas, is we used historical aerial photographs. So like you saw with that tall timbers one, what we have here is a photo from 1941. All these white areas here, those are all cleared areas, those are fields. And you can see kind of the kind of black little lumpy, bumpy trees there. And so we would just literally just go through photo after photo of like the same area and be like, okay, well, here's a field here. How did that change? When was it abandoned? Was it abandoned? And kind of figure out where we could put sites potentially. So if you look where the dots are, you can kind of see, as we go through the decades, how these lands have changed. So sometimes it goes back into vegetation and then they bring it back and put a field there again. So that's how we were able to find all of our restored sites. And we did, once we identified them using the photographs, go out and do a site visit and say, okay, is this actually pine savanna? We wanted to make sure it hadn't been burned that year for our measurements. And, is it, what we think it's supposed to be as far as, is it pine savanna? If it was identified as native ground cover, does it have some of those indicator species that we would associate with native ground cover? So once we had all our sites identified, we went out into the field and we collected a ton of data. So we collected data on the soil texture, bulk density, and chemical composition. We also looked at the soil fungal and bacterial communities. We collected herbaceous biomass. We measured woody plants to get estimates of their biomass using allometric equations. Same with tree diameter, breast height. We measured that to get estimates of tree biomass. We looked at total species composition for plants and also estimates of each species cover. We collected bees over 5 visits. And then we also took photographs for canopy cover and leaf area index, because in addition to the photos, we used some of these other elements like soil texture and biomass to put into our WEP model, which gave us an idea of the hydrological processes that were going on in these systems. So from all that data, we were able to get estimates of various ecosystem services. So some of the ones that we were interested in was plant biodiversity, timber production, wildfire risk reduction, pollination, carbon storage, erosion reduction, groundwater recharge, and overall soil health. So now for the exciting part, what did we actually find? All right, so if you're interested in plant biodiversity, we can look here at plant species richness. Before I go too much farther, I want to just kind of give you an overview of this figure here. You're going to be seeing a lot of figures that look similar to this. So I kept the color scheme the same. So as you're looking at all the different figures, you'll always see the row crop in white, the restored pine savannas in this blue, pine plantations are going to have this orangey red, pastures are going to be this kind of yellowy green, reference pine savannas are this dark green, and the unmanaged sites are going to be brown. And this LAI, you can just ignore this. This is part of the statistics. So if you're interested, you can look in the paper and kind of find out more there. Don't worry about that for now. It doesn't really impact the messaging of what I'm telling you. So don't worry about that. Along our x-axis here, we always start with the crop site on the left, and then we go through the years of our restored savanna. And then finally, this final column is our all other land uses. So basically, it's kind of showing you, like, as you progress from row crop, abandon that, restore, how does the system change? And then we'll have that comparison to our reference, the pine plantations, unmanaged, and the pastures. So you can easily see kind of how everything fares. The letters that are above or next to our points here, that has to do with the statistical significance of the test that we ran. So if you see two of the same letters, it means statistically those are similar, they're basically the same. Whereas if you have different letters, it's saying statistically, we're saying there's a difference there in the levels that we're finding. So for this example here, we're looking at plant species richness. So that is the number of plant species that we found on average per plot. So as you can see, if you look on the crop sites, very low species richness, but once you start restoration of these pine savannas, you quickly get an increase, and you see that increase continue throughout the 100 years of restoration, but it never quite makes the same level of richness as what we're seeing on average in these reference pine savanna sites. However, we do see a higher richness than what you'd get in a pine plantation or an unmanaged forest. So another aspect of our plant biodiversity is the amount of perennial grass cover that we're finding. One things we do know about of these reference pine savannas is that they are dominated by perennial grasses. And so we wanted to see, like, is that element coming back in our restored pine savannas? So similar to what we saw with the richness, we do see an increase from the row crop pretty quickly. But it really kind of levels off around 30 to 100 years. Like you're not seeing much change in the amount of perennial grass cover that we're finding. And that's interesting to note because even though we did find some of those kind of indicative species, like we did have a little bit of wiregrass, we did have a little bit of the little blue stem showing up in some of these older restored sites, you're not seeing the dominance of those species like you are in these reference pine savannas. This also has some implications for erosion reduction. So as you have that perennial ground cover, you have less runoff, so you have less erosion. So that's another kind of ecosystem services that you're gaining, and you can estimate from this perennial grass cover. Okay, so I know this looks like a lot, but it's not that bad, I promise. So we ran a non-metric multidimensional scaling ordination on our species composition data. So basically what we did is we took all of our species data, so all the species that we found in every plot, and the percent cover of all those species, and we took all of that data and we put it into this ordination. We said, how similar are these plots to each other? So what we have here is the output ordination. So each of these points is a plot. And the closer the points are together, the more similar they are to each other. They are also coded by shape. So that gives us the different study areas to see if maybe there's something going on in one study area that's not going on in another. And then we're color coded by the land cover type. The circles represent some 95% ellipsoid. You don't really have to worry about that other than just making it a little bit easier to see kind of where the clusters are for each of the land cover types. So what we see is that you have your pastures. They're their own pretty unique plant species composition. Row crops, once again, they're their own pretty much unique species composition. Unmanaged areas, again. Pine plantations, they're moving a little bit closer to what you'd see in a pine savanna, but they're still pretty unique. And now where the really interesting and the cool part comes is when you look at these restored pine savannas. Here I have them color coded from a light blue to dark blue, where light blue is the earliest and the youngest restored pine savannas. And so you can see you go from that light blue towards the dark blue, and that's going towards what we have in these native dark green points. So there is progression in this plant species composition to more similarity with our reference pine savannas. Now, we don't really get the integration of the points like we would expect to see if they were the same, but they're kind of headed in the right direction. So that's a really positive sign. Now, if you're interested in timber production as an ecosystem service, one of the ways we can estimate that is the amount of tree biomass on the site. And so we did that obviously with our row crops and our pastures. They're treeless sites. There is no tree biomass. You're not going to have timber production. So very quickly with the restoration of the pine savannas, you do see that increase in tree biomass. And actually within 5 to 15 years, you're not seeing a difference between the restored pine savannas and the reference pine savannas as far as the amount of tree biomass that you have there. It is less than what you see in pine plantations for obvious reasons. I mean, pines were planted for timber production. And it's also less tree biomass than you see in these unmanaged forests where it's just closed canopy forest. And even though we have less tree biomass in these restored and reference pine savannas, it doesn't mean that they're not valuable as a timber production site. Most of the sites that we were looking at as far as restored pine savannas were being used for kind of single tree selection forestry. So they were having some timber harvests on them. So you might not get as much as a clear cut of a loblolly plantation, but there is also profit in the service for timber production on those sites. If you're interested in kind of reducing your risk for wildfire, we looked at dead fuel biomass. So this is all of the dead fuel that we had in the systems, everything from the pine needles on the ground to your standing dead grass from the previous season to your coarse woody debris, down logs, anything like that. So we add up all of that, and what you see is that within 5 to 15 years, you're seeing a similar dead fuel biomass as what you'd get in these reference savannas. And it's very stable throughout the years, and that's because we had those frequent fires coming through, and you didn't have that buildup like you get in the pine plantations and the unmanaged, which had higher levels. So as far as a wildfire risk, it's fairly low for being a forested system. If you're interested in pollination, which I know a lot of people are, we collected bees and we looked both at the abundance of the bees, or how many bees we're catching, and also at the species and how many species that we were catching. And one of the things that, jumps out right away is that we were finding more bees in the row crops and in the pastures. And within the 5 to 15 years of restoring the pine savanna, we had fewer bees, but they were at similar levels to what you'd see in reference pine savannas. And the pine savannas, whether they were restored or reference, still had higher levels, higher abundance of bees than what we'd see in pine plantations and unmanaged. Now, part of the reason for this could just be, visibility. So the way we would catch the bees is we would use colored bowls. And so the bees would be attracted to the different colors, just like they were attracted to a different color of a flower. And so when you have just like a blue or a yellow bowl in the middle of a bahia grass pasture, it's very noticeable. It's the only thing around, and so it attracts a lot of bees. Whereas when you put that same bowl in a pine savanna, now you're competing with all the natural flowers there that, might also interest the bees. It's not quite as visible because it's usually right at the same level because the vegetation is a little bit higher. So that could also be another reason that we were catching more bees. One thing to note is that when you're looking at the number of bees we're catching, this is only telling you where the bees are foraging, not where they live in. So what is likely happening is you'll have the bees nesting in these pine savannas, because we know for a lot of the species that we found, they're ground nesting bees. And so if you're in an area that's disked annually, that's not very conducive to living in the ground. So it's likely that they live in the one place, but then they'll forage outside of that. So even though we might catch more bees in one area, they're still probably frequenting these pine savannas. As far as the number of species that we're finding, we really didn't see a difference in the number of species between the row crops, the pastures, and either the restored or the reference pine savannas. We found about the same number of species. And like I said, that's probably due to the fact that they're nesting in one area, but then going out and foraging in these other ones. All of those did have more bee species than what we were seeing in the pine plantations and in the unmanaged, and that's because bees don't really do well in closed canopy forests. There's not really a whole lot of floral resources for them to utilize there, and so they're just not as common. If you're interested in carbon sequestration, we did look at the total amount of ecosystem carbon that's being stored in these systems. So when I say the total ecosystem carbon, I'm saying all the carbon that's in the soil, all the carbon that's in the live vegetation, and also in all the dead debris and woody vegetation, everything like that. That's all counted as far as ecosystem carbon. So not too surprisingly, once you abandon agriculture, you see the rapid increase in the amount of carbon being stored. And within 5 to 15 years, you have similar levels of ecosystem carbon as what you would see in these reference pine savannas. Now, that's still less than what you see in an unmanaged forest, but that kind of makes sense because in these unmanaged forests, it's closed canopy, you have a lot of down debris, you have a lot of litter, whereas some of that is being volatilized and burned off in these pine savannas. But overall, within 5 to 15 years, you have about the same amount of total carbon in these restored systems. However, if you're just going to break down to just part of the carbon that we're finding, if you just wanted to look at the soil carbon, it's a little bit different story, which is kind of interesting because if you're just looking at the amount of carbon in the soil, it takes about 75 to 100 years to get above the level that you're going to see in row crop agriculture and to be similar to a reference pine savanna. And part of this is just due to that it's going to be like the turnover of the fine roots in the soil, but it also tells us a lot about where the carbon is being stored in these systems. So even though overall the levels were similar very early on, it's not being stored in the same places. So in the restored pine savannas, it's more of the carbon is being stored above ground in the vegetation. And part of this could be because during the earlier years of these pine savannas, they tend to have a larger kind of a shrubby and woody component. And so they'll hold a little bit more carbon. And then later on, as it kind of turns more herbaceous system, you're going to have less above, but you're going to have more of that carbon being stored below ground. So, and there is an argument for the carbon being stored below ground as being a little bit more stable because then it is not going to be lost in fires or anything like that. So something just to keep in mind if carbon storage is something that you're really interested in. If you're wanting to reduce the amount of erosion in a system, getting it out of agriculture, row crop agriculture is a great way to do it, as you can imagine. So here we're looking at the surface runoff that had happened in a system in about a year. And so very quickly, within 5 to 15 years, you see that decrease in surface runoff, and it's going to be similar to what you'd find in a reference pine savanna. And that is purely due to just that kind of, perennial ground cover, kind of keeping the soil stabilized, intercepting the rain. You're having a little bit more evaporation off the leaves, so it's not hitting the soil and running off. And also you have more that's being actually like infiltrating into the ground. As far as if you're interested in the amount of groundwater recharge, we did an estimate of the deep percolation that's going on. So deep percolation would be the water that's actually going into the ground. It's not being utilized by the plants. It's not going like a subsurface flow out of the system either. It's actually going all the way down into groundwater reservoirs. So think of things like, recharging the aquifer. So your drinking water, think of things like that. Your groundwater recharge is part of that. And what we see is that even though we have a pretty good amount of percolation water going into the soil in these row crop sites, you don't have as many plants taking it up. So you have more that's able to go farther down. So it is a little bit higher than what you see in these restored pine savannas. But within 5 to 15 years, you have similar levels as what you'd see in a reference pine savanna. And those are all higher than what you see in these heavily forested systems that are utilizing a lot of the water that is going into the ground. Now, one of the things that I would like to point out is you kind of see this little U-shaped thing going on here. And this is because, how I mentioned that you kind of have that period where it's a little shrubbier earlier on. And so that's really what we're seeing here is because we have that higher shrub component in the system, those shrubs are taking up a little bit more water as it transitions towards more of that herbaceous ground cover and a little bit away from some of the woodies. you kind of see that uptake again of like, okay, the woodies aren't taking it up, it can finally percolate all the way down into to recharging. So in addition to groundwater recharge and runoff, we can also look at the soil bulk density. That gives you an idea of what's going on at the surface, and also has some implications for soil health. So soil bulk density is a measurement of the amount of soil per volume. So basically it's telling you how compact is your soil. So the higher the number, the more compact the soil is. So not too surprisingly on these, pretty intensively managed sites like your row crops and your pastures where you're having tractors going through multiple times a year, the soil tends to be pretty compact. Whereas, within 5 to 15 years of abandoning agriculture, you're going to see, a less compact soil, similar to what you'd see maybe in these reference pine savannas. And like I said, this has implications for, erosion reduction, because the more compact soils, typically the water can't get down into it and it runs off. Also for your groundwater recharge, if the soil is not as compact, it will impact the infiltration rates within the soil. So there's that, and then just kind of overall soil health of like the roots being able to kind of move down in there as well, which impacts how compact the soil is as well. So it's all kind of linked together. So we did look at many different mineral nutrients in the soil. I'm just going to be showing the soil phosphorus because it's the most interesting. So the soil phosphorus, once you abandon agriculture, you see a big drop right away. It's a pretty sharp decline in the amount of phosphorus. It's different than what you'd see in row crop by 15 to 30 years. But it takes you about 75 to 100 years to get to the same levels of phosphorus that you'd see in these reference pine savannas. Even though, you're not having any kind of fertilizer applied to these systems, it just takes a long time for these plants to be able to, I guess, utilize all the excess phosphorus. When we looked at some of the other nutrients like the calcium, magnesium, potassium, you really saw a quick decrease similar to what we had here, but it much more quickly reached the level that you see in reference pine savannas. Usually by 15 or so years, it would be similar levels. So in addition to the mineral nutrients, we also looked at the fungal components of the soils to kind of get an idea of how healthy our soils were. So when we looked at the fungi, we were able to group them into guilds. So if you can think of a guild as kind of, maybe what kind of function or what kind of role might this fungi be playing. So one of the things they might do is they might be a pathogen for plants. So that was one of our groupings. So here we have the percentage of plant pathogens that we were finding in our fungal community. You can see we did have higher levels in these row crops, and in pastures, it very quickly decreased. And by 15 to 30 years, we were seeing similar levels of plant pathogens as what you would expect in a native or a reference pine savanna. If we're interested in the mycorrhizal associations, so we actually split the mycorrhizal fungi into ectomycorrhizal and endomycorrhizal, just because they might be a little bit different as far as, when they come back or what species they might associate with. So I might give you a little bit clue of what's going on. For the ectomycorrhizal, we have a large, a pretty quick increase. So within 5 to 15 years, you're very much different than what you'd have in a row crop. You'd have a lot more. And within, 15 to 30 years, you're having pretty similar levels to what you see in these reference pine savannas. Now it is worth noting that these unmanaged sites typically have higher levels of these mycorrhizal fungi. I'm not 100% sure why, but that does seem to be the trend, whereas it's more like intensive agriculture sites like the crops and the pastures tend to have very low levels of the mycorrhizal associations. The endomycorrhizal fungi had a pretty similar pattern where you saw a big increase, but it took a little bit longer. It took about maybe 30 to 50 years before they had similar levels to what we were seeing in our reference pine savannas. Okay, so I'm going to throw another NMS at you guys, but it's okay. So this one is the soil, the fungal community composition. So all the data that we had about the fungi and how much of each type that we had, we put this in and said, how similar are our plots? So just a reminder, so the closer the points are, the more similar they are. And they're once again coded by shape, which is the different study areas, and then color, which is the land use. So once again, you kind of see that pastures kind of its own unique community, row crops, it's pretty much own unique community. On the opposite side, we see the unmanaged and the pine plantations have their own pretty much unique fungal communities. And right here in the middle again, we have our restored pine savannas. Once again, going from that light blue of the earliest years, kind of going through the darker blue to the more mature restored savannas, and approaching these native or reference savannas. Again, we didn't see complete integration, so they're not the same fungal community, but they are becoming increasingly similar. So that's encouraging because we know that there are a lot of important associations between the plant community and what we have there and what's going on below ground. So we did the same thing with the bacterial community. It's a little bit a little bit more jumbled and scattered as far as what's going on there. Even though we don't have as clean groupings as we did with the plants and the fungi, we do see that you kind of have a similar trend in that the row crop and pastures tend to be over here on one side, a little bit more similar, and the unmanaged forest sites tend to be on the other side. The one big difference here is that the pine plantations tend to be kind of integrated with these early restored pine savannas as far as what kind of bacterial community composition you have in the soil. We once again have these progression from the earliest pine savanna restoration sites, moving through the more mature and going towards that native community system. But once again, we didn't have that complete integration. So they're not the same, but they are moving towards a greater similarity when you're looking at the bacterial community in the soil. Okay, final figure. Hang with me. This one is a little bit of a mess, but I'll walk you through it. So this one is an NMS of all of the variables that we gather data on. So all the soil, all the fungi, the bacteria, the plant data, everything, the bees. And we said, okay, if you look at everything together, how similar are our plots? And so once again, we have them coded by the study area being the shape, and then the color being the land cover type. The lines here are basically showing the correlations with the axes. So if you look here, there's a pretty strong kind of this left-right trend going across this x-axis. And so everything on this left side here, you're looking at is saying, well, that's being very heavily influenced by the mycorrhizal associations, the fungi, the fuel biomass, the ecosystem carbon, the tree biomass, whereas everything on the opposite side tends to be more influenced by having higher plant pathogens or greater number of bees, or in the middle here we have a lot of our soil and mineral nutrients. And then we have ones kind of in the middle here where we have the number of native plants or the soil carbon or the amount of perennial grass. So when you look at this and you look at the colors, you're kind of seeing once again a similar trend where you have your row crops are kind of over here. Near them you have pastures, which are over here. On the opposite side, we have these unmanaged forests and the pine plantations. And then right in the middle, you have all these restored pine savannas. And you can kind of see where it goes from these lighter colored blues over to the darker blues, which is getting closer to these dark greens for the reference pine savannas. And so really, if you're interested in maybe a particular ecosystem service, you can say, well, I'm really interested in reducing my wildfire risk. So I know that the dead fuel biomass over here, that's it's strong related to that. And so maybe I don't want to have unmanaged forest or pine plantation. Well, maybe I don't really want to have row crop or pasture either. And so you kind of have this sweet spot in the middle where you have all these pine savannas where they're really kind of giving you the biggest bang for your buck, and that you're getting a lot of different services that are being provided, even if they might not be the best in any particular one, except for, plant biodiversity, which, not saying plant biodiversity is not important, because I love plant biodiversity. So that's really what we're seeing here in this figure, is just kind of showing that, it might not have the most bees, but you have more than you have in this one over here in your pine forests or your unmanaged forests. So once again, like kind of just that biggest bang for your buck in providing a lot of services. So overall, what do we find? So if you start with bare soil of just abandoning agriculture, you just let passive succession take its place and you apply frequent fire, you get plant, fungal, and bacteria species compositions that are moving towards the reference conditions. You have all of our environmental variables that are changing towards the reference conditions. You are expected to have reduced erosions on the site. You're expected to have greater groundwater recharge than if you were to convert it to a pine plantation or just leave it unmanaged. And for most of these variables, like we were seeing a large change within those first, 5 to 15 years. So that's fairly rapid. But there were some pretty notable exceptions, things like our soil carbon and phosphorus, which were taking 75 years to reach the same level that we'd have in a reference savanna. And then we did have some things like our native plant biodiversity, our fungal communities that didn't quite make it there within those 100 years. So really what I think is one of the big takeaways from this research is the value that these old field pine savannas have. So these restored savannas, especially if they're older, they're providing a lot of services. They're closer to maybe the reference condition than you might expect for a lot of things. So if you are a manager and you have old fields, maybe take some time to consider, how are you managing them? Do you have an area that's old field that's, not been touched by any kind of, soil disturbance, and you've been applying fire, and, it's been 50 years since agriculture, like that's probably a pretty good site. You might want to consider like, okay, making sure we get fire in there frequently, and, taking a little bit more care about how we're moving our equipment through it, and things like that, because, it is providing a lot of services than you get from something that's, just a year or two out of agriculture. And it does show, like if you go out and walk into these systems where, you're on the ground and if you look at the plants, you can tell the difference between some of these restored sites versus, what's really young, what's still the baby, versus, what one's, mature and, really kind of coming into its own as a pine savanna. Overall, if you're interested in kind of really, making sure that, you're getting the ecosystem services that are provided by these kind of natural systems that we have, like the pine savannas, but you also are making sure that we have, maybe the timber that we need, or, hunting grounds, or, food to eat. You really can have this balance of provision of the ecosystem services using kind of a mosaic effect, instead of just saying, okay, well, this is the best at everything, because there isn't one that's the best at everything. But if you look at pine savannas, they're giving you a lot for what they are. And it's important to just keep going with the restoration, because it's working. And with that, I will gladly open it up to any questions that people may have. So.
All right, Cinnamon. Well, thank you so much for your presentation. 1 second as we add. There it is. If you joined us while she was presenting, this is Cinnamon Dixon. She's a fire ecologist at Tall Timbers Research Station in Tallahassee, and she was talking about publication on pine savanna restoration ecosystem services that she and Kevin Robertson at Tall Timbers led and have recently published. We do have time remaining in our program today to take questions from the audience. If you will please use the Q&A tool in Zoom. I see we've already got some questions that have come in. We're going to go ahead and use that to try and get to those questions. If you see other questions that folks have asked that you would like us to try and address, please give them a thumbs up, and that will help. And I see a comment from Caroline that said this was a huge project with lots of ecosystem services to look into. Great job. Thank you for sharing. Caroline, that's pretty much what I said when I reread their paper this morning and meeting with Cinnamon. And my first comment was like, holy cow, you guys took a lot of measurements. That was a lot of work. So good effort. And thank you for taking the time, Cinnamon, to walk us through the figures and explain the stats, especially those multidimensional analyses, which are sometimes hard to wrap your head around. So without further ado, let's try and get to some of these questions. And right off the bat, we had a question that came in from Jens. And Jens, I'm going to try and kind of get to and summarize. Jens had two different questions, and I want to see if we can get to those. One, Jens was asking about the grazing regimes on the pasture land that you guys looked at. Jens had comments that he sent in to us uh, through Zoom about, he was interested in the type of cattle that were on the land and the grazing regime. And could you talk about that? Do you have any information from that perspective?
I don't have too much information about the regimes. It's my understanding for the most part, these were just kind of continuously grazed pastures. But for the most part, a lot of our pasture sites were strictly just hay production. They weren't actively being grazed at all. So I don't know the specifics of, if there was, particular breed that we were seeing more often than others, that of the ones that did have cattle on them. So I can't really speak too much to that.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks. I think, Jens, we'll have Cinnamon's email address up on the screen. If you guys want to continue that conversation afterwards, that's an opportunity to. I think Jen's comments get to uh, an interesting point about silvopasture. So where you had a combination of pine savanna restoration or pine savanna in different states combined with different breeds of grazers. And whether I think some of Jen's questions were whether they were sort of heritage breeds of cattle on the land or more contemporary genetics and the kind of grazing that occurs on the lands. I think those are good questions, and I think it could be an opportunity for additional research um, on these sites. So good questions. And Jens, I get to your other question here if I can. Also had a question about soil bulk density, and so Jens was asking if just for some clarification, I think, and I don't know if you want to jump back and look at your slides, um, in the observed soil bulk density in the pasture versus the row crop sites. Could you talk about that, Cinnamon?
For the soil bulk density, what we're seeing is you saw pretty similar levels to what we had in row crops, and that they were both pretty compact soils. And I think that had to do with the fact that, they did have, frequent, tractors going over them, whether for, cutting hay or whether it was, applying fertilizer or, whatever they were doing to the row crop sites. So they're both pretty, or, even in some cases where it might have been the livestock. But yeah, they're both pretty compact, is what we found.
Here's a question that in the Q&A from Susan, and Susan's asking about bees in the study. And did you guys differentiate between native and non-native bee species?
Let me try to remember. I think most of what we were finding was native bees. I think we only caught about like 2 honeybees, which are of course non-native. But I think as far as like our analyses, we didn't differentiate between whether they were native or not. We didn't throw them out. So
A few questions in here from Kurt about fungus presence. And Kurt says, were you able to specifically identify citrid fungus presence in your fungal sampling, and which habitat was the highest and the lowest? It's a very specific question. And if I mispronounce that, my apologies, because I'm not familiar with that type of fungus.
I'd have to look back at our fungal data. My colleague Ben Sykes up at the University of Canada or Kansas, he did all of our fungal analysis because that is not my forte. But I could look back if he's interested. I could try to find out what data we have if that was available.
And Kurt's follow-up, more generally speaking, asks, would you expect fire prevalence to reduce fungal abundance and diversity?
I have seen some research that shows like in sites that are burned, you do see a little bit of reduce diversity, and it seems to be almost the opposite of what you'd expect with plants. So plants typically you'd have, oh, well, these ones like fire, they do well with fire. And so it kind of selects for those species, whereas it appears anyway, with a lot of the fungal communities, it tends to be, well, this one can survive it. And it's not necessarily that they like it, but they can survive it. So I would expect you'd probably see a decrease in diversity.
Great question here from Chelsea in Zoom. Chelsea asks, did you collect any data on the composition of the seed bank before restoration and the role that might have played in species richness and composition over time? Great question, Chelsea.
No, we did not. As you kind of saw with when I was going over a little bit of our methods, so we used a chrono sequence. So we weren't on the ground at time 0 for any of these sites. But just based on the little we know about, if you're disking annually, really kind of what is going to be in that seed bank are kind of those annual weeds. So I wouldn't expect them to really be playing a large part in kind of redeveloping our plant community. It certainly helps to at least get vegetation on the ground to start with before you get some of those more late successional species in, but we didn't actually have any data on what was there at time 0.
Mm-hmm. Interesting question from Megan about, we're back to bees. Megan says, when you completed the experiment with bee richness, what color bowl were the bees most attracted to?
Okay, so for our study, we collected our bees kind of that late summer and fall, and we had white, yellow, and blue bowls put out there. When we collected, we just poured them all together. We didn't keep them separate for this study. I can tell you that when we got to collect, I seemed to see a lot more bees in the blue bowls, and then the yellow, and then finally white. But I don't know how much that was influenced by the season, because I've also collected bees for another project in the spring, and it seemed like there were a lot of them attracted to the white then. So I don't know if that has to do with, maybe what is flowering at what time, maybe what they're kind of leaning towards or what species. So that's just kind of observation of in the field, but no hard data to back it up.
Mm-hmm. David asked a question as well. Did the sample sites include sites across a hydrologic gradient? And then goes into detail about mesic and xeric and that sort of thing. But that is a good question. Was there variability in terms of that across
For
sites?
our sites, we kept them all in ultrasoil soils, so they're kind of more of a mesic soil. We didn't go down into the drains where it gets a little more hydric, or we didn't have any sand hills. This is all in the red hills, so it's a little more of a clay hill type site. So you don't have any 2 xeric sites that are very common around here. So.
And Max asked the question, did you notice a difference in locations with regards to fire intensity or time of year of the burn?
We don't have data directly on when things were burned, because these were various different private properties. They were typically, we know, because most of the pine savannas that we were sampling were done on quail hunting properties, and so most of that burning is done in March and April. Because they're burned mostly every 1 to 2 years, it's usually pretty low intensity, low severity fires that are going through. So nothing really, because they were so similar as far as our knowledge of how these managers are burning. We didn't really expect or see anything that would jump out as, hey, maybe they're burning differently and we're seeing something different. So.
I was wondering about the season of burn impacts on what you observed with perennial grasses over time. If a lot of the sites were burned in the early growing season to dormant season, I wondered if that was kind of playing a factor in the perennial grasses kind of plateauing on the sites.
I mean, it's absolutely possible, because I know a lot of the perennial grasses, especially things like wiregrass, they are stimulated to produce when you're burning in the growing season. The problem is that when you're burning these old field sites, they don't really burn well in the growing season, because they also tend to have that a little bit higher, less shrubby component, a lot of higher fuel moisture. And so if you're going to get burns, then you kind of have to do them a little bit earlier. It would be interesting to see if some people were interested in taking maybe some of their older restored sites and kind of maybe trying to play a little bit with fire regime there. And if anybody's can come up with something that maybe like maybe if it's after 75 years old, maybe then you can
Yeah,
start shifting the burn season. I don't
yeah,
know.
it'd be
Maybe.
interesting to look at. Well, Cinnamon, we are wrapping up our time here today. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your presentation. Do you have any final comments or remarks that you would like to share to wrap this up?
Sure. So I would say of all the different variables and the services that I've discussed today, really the common denominator is fire. So you can link fire either directly or indirectly to pretty much every service that I discussed. And so I think one of the main points is that in order to successfully restore these pine savannas, you got to get fire on the landscape, and it's got to be frequent. So, but it's hopeful in that we're seeing progress in restoration. So it's just you gotta keep at it, even if it might take 100 years.
All right. Well, thank you so much. If you would like to follow up with Cinnamon, we've got her slides on the screen, and um, you can continue the conversation afterwards. And I also saw that Elliot put her email address in the chat. So if you'd like to continue that conversation, you can. And with that, thank you everybody for joining us today. We hope that this webinar will be useful in your fire management programs. And thank you especially, Cinnamon, for taking the time to share your research and talk about your project with us today. So have a great afternoon, everybody.